We record. I've been to Roma. I've been to BJ. I've searched all over for a place to pray. I found the mosh pit and knew that this was it. I am a moshnik and I'm here to stay. And we're turning gray, aren't we? Come on, everybody, sing with me. I found community that is in tune with me, singing and dancing in a Zumagaga. Some contemplation, hey Mary, you just dance it, mixed with elation. I am a moshnik and I'm here to stay. And I'm turning white actually. A chance to meet you, a chance to greet you, Bruchim Habayim, a time to deepen what it means to belong. Let's have some fun tonight and spread some joy and light. I am a moshnik and I'm here to stay. And we're turning gray. Let's hear a little harmonica huff. The Bob Hoffman Memorial Harmonica Solo. Every Wednesday night dedicated to the memory of our dear Hoff. Alrighty, very nice. And welcome everyone to this very special evening. As I welcome not only my friend, not only my colleague, but my teacher, Rabbi Leila Gal Berner. I am going to give a very quick introduction that's going to have nothing to do if you Googled her and found out all the wonderful things she's done, but rather a kind of quick personal reflection of how we came to meet and a story that we share. And so the very first time, Reb Leila, you reminded me of this story some time ago. The very first time we met was in the offices at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and I think it was in 1991, around there. I was applying to RR. Yeah, that's how old we are. I was applying to RRC. Now, I was eventually accepted, but I didn't go. But years later, Reb Leila reminded me that she was a student on the panel along with Rabbi Art Green and a number of other people that interviewed me and accepted me. And that apparently in the meeting afterwards, they all said, we'll accept him, but he won't last very long here. And those were for different reasons. But many moons later, I found myself in the Aleph Rabbinical program. Reb Leila was my teacher for many different classes. And tonight, I have an opportunity to welcome you, Reb Leila, as a colleague and still a teacher. So from Frederick, Maryland, please give a most welcome to Rabbi Leila Gal Berner. And as we like to say, welcome, Reb Leila.
I have many memories of many times with Reb Mark, and they're all happy ones. And I think the memory that I cherish the most is that Reb Mark and Renee were very loving and helpful with my daughter Kayla at a very difficult time, and really gave her a lot of love and care. And I am deeply appreciative of that. So thank you. I'd like to begin by inviting you with me to say the bracha, to say the blessing for study and soaking ourselves in Torah. So please join me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Amen. So I have the great joy tonight of offering you a new gateway into Torah, which I have called Kriyat HaKodesh, or reading the sacred, which is a way of listening to Torah in contemplative silence so that it speaks to our hearts and souls. It's very different than the traditional way of studying Torah, which we often engage with, which is kind of a back and forth yeshiva-like way. I call it ping pong study, where we say something and someone else says, well, that's interesting, but I disagree, or I have a different perspective, and we go back and forth in that kind of way. This is very contemplative. This is often very silent, and at the end, we can share some time interactively, but the process itself is very non-interactive in most of its form. It's founded based on a Christian contemplative practice called Lectio Divina. And Lectio Divina really began with the Christian church father, Saint Benedict, in the late 5th and into the mid 6th century. And when I first found or encountered Lectio Divina, I found it an extremely powerful medium for entering into the biblical text in a very personal way. I want to tell you a story of when about 25 years ago, maybe even a little longer, I was training to become a spiritual director in the Lev Shomea program. And my teachers were Rabbi Avram Addison, Barbara Brightman, and Zeri Weiss. And one day we were sitting at Eilat Chaim at the Jewish Retreat Center, and we were sitting in a lovely room there, and Avram began with a nigun, with a wordless melody, and we all joined him. And then he read us a piece of text, and we listened carefully. And then he went into silence. And we thought, okay, this is great. And after the silence, we'll discuss. And at the end of the silence, he began to sing the nigun again. We thought, great. And the silence was around 5 minutes. And that seemed somewhat long to us, but we went with it. And after the second round of singing, we thought, now we'll discuss. And he simply read the text slowly and deliberatively again. And we listened to it very carefully. And we thought, okay, now we're going to discuss the text. And he went back into silence. And this time the silence was a little bit longer. And this went on 3 times. He read the text to us 3 times with the 5 or 6 minutes of silence in between. And after the silence, he sang the nigun again. And after the 3rd time, we were all really ready to discuss. And he said to us, Shalom Aleichem, have a good afternoon. And we all sort of sat there stunned and didn't quite know what to do, but we got up and we left. And I was really, really taken by this. And the text was rolling around in my head and in my heart. I honestly can't tell you all these years later what the text was, but at the time it was just pounding in my heart. And I went out into a meadow at Eilat Chaim, and I just sat there and I thought about this text, and it was just touching my heart in very, very powerful ways. Later, about 2 or 3 hours later at dinner, I went to Reb Avram and I said to him, could you explain to me what happened there? And he said, that's called Lectio Divina. And he asked me, he said, did it have an effect on you? And I said, yes, it did. It had a very profound effect on me. And I entered into the text in a way that I had never experienced before. And he said, that is a Catholic Benedictine way of praying. And then he proceeded to explain to me the different steps of Lectio Divina. And I thought to myself that this is really profound. And I wanted to bring this to Jews. But I understood that bringing it to Jews meant that I needed to somehow introduce other elements into the process, because we Jews are a very loquacious people, and we like to learn things about the text. But I was also aware that we tend to talk too much, and we tend not to enable ourselves to sit in silence and to contemplate the text enough. So over the next few years, I did a couple of things. The first thing I did is I joined a Catholic Lectio Divina group where we met once a month, and I joined it for about 6 months. I don't remember whether it was 6 months or 8 months, but I prayed with the Catholics. I did it exactly the way the Catholics did it, which was entirely in silence. We would come in, we would wish each other peace, we would sit down, someone would read the text, we'd go into silence, and they would do that 4 times. And at the end of the fourth reading and silence, we would wish each other peace again, and we'd go on our way. In the 6 or 7 months in which I participated, I only knew the names of my fellow participants, and I didn't know much about them because there was not a lot of crosstalk or conversation or anything else. It was really quite astounding and profound. And then over those same years, the second thing that I did is I began to study Torah very, very deeply and began to figure out how to bring this to my co-religionists, to other Jews. And I tried it out with people, and what I added was an element of learning and an element of questioning, which was to start with a nigun and an element of song. So I would start with a nigun and then choose a text and read that text, and then find midrashim about that text that I would teach. And then I would ask questions, very personal questions, about the learning and about the text, and then go into silence. And I did that 3 times. And over the years, it got refined and developed and everything else. And I started teaching it at Aleph, in the Aleph program. And the students started responding very, very powerfully to it. And they said, we've never studied Torah this way, but we're going deep inside with it, and that's very, very powerful. It's very meaningful to us. It's a very inward, very personal way of looking at the text and realizing that any Torah text, whether it comes from Genesis or whether it comes from Deuteronomy, can resonate personally very powerfully. So I started out with Sefer Breshit, with the book of Genesis, and over the years I developed this into a book, and the book is called Listening to the Heart of Genesis, A Contemplative Path. And I've been teaching that with Aleph students for many years. And they in turn have learned how to do it. In the back of the book, there's a facilitator's guide, and any of you could learn how to do it, how to teach it, and how to practice it. And my goal is that people all over can start groups in their communities, in their shoals, in their Zoomagogues, in their wherever. Just today, I received an email. And my goal was also to bring this practice to people of other faiths who were interested. And last year, with Sabrina's help, we began our first foray into this with a group with the Washington Friends, the Quakers, and we did a 6-week exploration of Genesis, which we are going to repeat in October. And at the end of our session together, I'll tell you more about that. So tonight, we are not going to be in Genesis because our Parsha for this week is from Deuteronomy. We are approaching the end of the Torah as we come towards the end of the year, and we're in Elul, in the month of Elul, and soon the Yamim Noraim, the days of awe, will be upon us. And so our Parsha for tonight is Ki Tavo, which is from Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 1 through 29, verse 8. And so I want to begin by giving you a little bit of the context of Ki Tavo, and then we'll go into a first reading of the text and go from there. And I ask you to be muted, but if the Nigun speaks to you, please sing it to yourselves once you become familiar with it.
We are very used to singing as we are muted here in the Zoomagogue.
I imagine so. Cacophony on Zoom and singing is not great, especially for a contemplative practice. So we begin with the context. The context is the later part of the Israelites' journey in the wilderness. They will soon be entering the promised land, and Moses, is preparing them for their new lives there. He is transmitting God's instructions to them as they enter the land, knowing that he himself will not be going with them. It is bittersweet for Moses, yet he is faithfully continuing to teach his people. So a first reading of the text. Ki tavo el haaretz. When you enter the land that the Holy One your God is giving you as a heritage, and you possess it and settle in it, you shall take some of the first fruit of the soil, which you harvest from the soil that the Holy One is giving you. Put it in a basket and go to the place where the Holy One your God will choose to establish the divine name. You shall then recite as follows before the Holy One your God. My father was a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt with a meager numbers and sojourned there. But there he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to the Holy One, to the God of our ancestors, and Yud-He Vav-He heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. The Holy One freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm, an awesome power, and by signs and portents. He brought us up to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil, which you, Holy One, have given me. A first teaching. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, of blessed memory, taught, "We are a nation of storytellers." Here in Parashat Kitavo, history is institutionalized into our people's story. Rabbi Sacks tells us, here for the first time, the retelling of the nation's history becomes an obligation for every citizen of the nation. In this act, known as Vidui Bikurim, the confession made over first fruits, the Jews were commanded, as it were, to become a nation of storytellers. The great scholar Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi tells us that only in Israel and nowhere else is the injunction to remember felt as a religious imperative to our entire people. Time and again throughout Sefer Dvarim, Deuteronomy, comes the command to remember. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt. Remember what Amalek did to you. Remember what God did to Miriam. Remember the days of old. Consider the generations long past. Ask your parents and they will tell you, your elders, and they will explain to you. The Vidui Bikurim is more than this. It is compressed into the shortest possible space, the entire history of the nation in summary form. In a few short sentences, we have here the ancestral origins in Mesopotamia. My father was a wandering Aramean. The emergence of the Hebrew nation in the midst of history rather than in mythic prehistory. Slavery in Egypt and liberation therefrom. The climactic acquisition of the land of Israel, and throughout the acknowledgement of God as the God of history. This is the story of our people. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, ay, ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, ay, ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. We are a nation of storytellers. We have our collective story. We are a people of history and memory. we bring our vidui bikurim, an offering of first fruits, the best of ourselves, to God and the world. Ask yourself, what is my story? What are my first fruits? What are the special gifts that I have brought into the world? What are my talents, my offerings? How have I brought the best of me into the world? Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, ay, ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. A second reading. Kitavo el haaretz. When you enter the land that the Holy One your God is giving you as a heritage, and you possess it and settle in it, you shall take some of the first fruit of the soil, which you harvest from the soil that the Holy One is giving you. Put it in a basket and go to the place where the Holy One your God will choose to establish the divine name. You shall then recite as follows before the Holy One your God. My father was a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there. But there he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to the Holy One, the God of our ancestors, and Yud-He Vav-He heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. The Holy One freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm, and an awesome power, and by signs and portents. He brought us up to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil, which you, Holy One, have given me. A second teaching. When a group of disparate people has its own common story, that group of separate individuals become an a collectivity, a unity. And when they become a nation of storytellers, they are a people bound by collective responsibility to one another, to the past and the future, and responsibility, an ability to respond to their God. By framing a narrative that successive generations would make their own and teach their children, the ancient Israelites, later Jews, became a nation of leaders. Unity breeds responsibility, and responsibility. When a nation of storytellers becomes a people, they are able to dwell in the memory of their people, and they live in history as well as in the future. They live with a sense of responsibility to their people and to the world, and responsibility and ability to respond to their God through their acts in the world. Ask yourself, what is my relationship with my people, the Jewish people? How do I live in Jewish history as well as in the Jewish future? How do I respond to other people? And how am I able to respond to God? Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, ay, ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, ay, ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. A third reading. Ki tavo el haaretz. When you enter the land that the Holy One your God is giving you as a heritage, and you possess it and settle in it, and you shall take some of the first fruit of the soil, which you harvest from the soil that the Holy One is giving you. Put it in a basket and go to the place where the Holy One your God will choose to establish the divine name. You shall then recite as follows before the Holy One your God. My father was a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there. But there he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to the Holy One, the God of our ancestors, and Yud-He-Vav-He heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. The Holy One freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm, and awesome power, and by signs and portents. He brought us up to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil, which you, Holy One, have given me. A third teaching. Rabbi Rachel Barenplatt teaches that Ki Tavo reminds us about arrival. When you enter the land of promise, the land of dreams, the land of goals and aspirations. When we enter the land, Rabbi Barenblatt reminds us, we must stop and remember where we came from. When we reach the thing we've been waiting for and working for, we must stop and be thankful, and then honor the sacredness of our own stories. When we reach the moment we've been walking toward, or running toward, or yearning for, or trudging toward, we must cultivate gratitude and then tell ourselves how we got there. We must reconnect with our stories, our individual story, and our collective story. We are now in the month of Elul. We are on the 13th day of Elul. Rosh Hashanah will soon arrive. It will be the time of Cheshbon Nefesh, an inventory of the soul. We will reflect on our story of the year that has passed, and we will be peering into our souls to reflect on where we have journeyed this year, what has happened to us, where we are going, what we want. We will ask ourselves what our story, personal and communal, has been this past year. We will discover that the land of promise is already with us and is also but a yearning. And we will stop and remember where we came from. We will stop and be thankful for the year's bounties, and we will grieve the losses and rejoice in the blessings. When we enter the land, Rabbi Berenblatt reminds us, we must stop and remember where we came from. When we reach the land we've been waiting for and working for, we must stop and be thankful and then honor the sacredness of our own stories. When we reach the moment we've been walking toward, or running toward, or yearning toward, or trudging toward, we must cultivate gratitude. Ask yourself, we are arriving. When you arrive at a promised land, at a goal, an aspiration, how do you give thanks? How do you reconnect with your personal story or with the story of your people? Has your story grown? Has it changed? What is new in the story of the growing narrative of your life? How will you make the story of this coming year even better than last year's? Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. I invite you now, if you feel so moved, to speak to this offering, to speak to what may have moved you, to speak to the text or the questions or the nigun. We have about 10 minutes, I think, about. And I open it up. Please unmute yourself if you'd like to speak and raise your hand. And we can have, this is the part of the time that we have together to share a little.
Devorah, please start us off.
Well, this was really good. And I just came on, well, a month ago, finished Smicha week, and this was one of the courses that I took. And feels like a long time ago. But what I found was that it took me into a very meditative place very quickly. And the rhythm and the meditation and the teaching, it was like putting on a familiar sweater or something. It just felt really comfortable and really easy to ground in it. So thank you.
Bina.
The thing I love about this process is that I have one of those little racy minds. And when I study Torah, I don't spend enough time on each phrase. And when you break it down into a shorter section and repeat it, it particularly lends itself to my learning style. And I'm just so grateful because it gives me a chance to really hold on to a piece of Torah in a very personal way and to really ask myself questions about it that you've offered us and other questions that came up, that you didn't offer us. And so I really appreciate this work so much. I'm so excited about the class. I hope others will join us.
Elizabeth has her hand up.
Thank you. Thank you, Reb Leila. It was just, it just feels like my way to do it this way. And I began hearing, even with the first reading of the text, I felt like I am that wandering Aramean. And it just, the pace and with the nigun and the different ways of questioning, the different layers of questioning, and was just lovely. And I would love to bring this to other people.
Mary Rita.
It was so peaceful and there was such a calm inside. I know this from a long time ago. And I've done it once or twice with Reb Leila. I want to teach it more also. There was just such a calmness, and all I wanted to do was just be quiet and listen. Be quiet and listen. And the first reading, I was just grabbed by like the first fruits, or bringing, a basket of first fruits. And it was like bringing myself and what are my first fruits that I am bringing. And I couldn't get further than that. And that was okay. And then the Nagun just, each time the Nagun took me deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Yeah, thank you.
One thing I do want to say is that one word, one verse can grab you, and it really doesn't matter if the rest doesn't grab you. If that one verse holds you, then stay with it. Stay with it. It can dwell in you for a day, a week, a month, and it's a really wonderful way of entering and just staying with it. And you don't have to take in the whole thing. And if there are other questions that arise, that's great. That's great. That the questions that I ask may not be your questions, but the questions that you ask may indeed be the ones that you need to focus on.
Elizabeth, you have your hand up again?
Yeah.
Please, especially since we can hear you.
Okay.
So now we can't see you, though. There you go.
Well, so I actually wanted to also journal with it. That those questions were so pertinent, and I had a sense of just going deeper and deeper that way too.
You are encouraged to journal. There are people who have journaled. There are people who have drawn, who have
Yeah.
done pictures. Whatever feels right for you is the way to do it. There's no one prescribed absolute way to do this. And I want to repeat again that in the book, there's a facilitator's guide. So if you want to learn how to do this, you can try it out with friends or with a group, and go with it. And all the steps are all there. And I also encourage you to try mixing it up a little bit. If you feel that the exact prescription that's written there is not quite right, then try it a little differently and see how it feels.
So I want to ask a question, and then I'll have a comment. Where does this reading ring a bell to anyone? Go ahead, Shosh.
Yeah, of course, Pesach.
Of course, Pesach. So the reading, the Haggadah, the telling, is a exercise in meaning making, right? In remembering, putting back the pieces that tells our story, and then we see our personal stories in the larger story, which for me is part of this process as well, which is fairly typical of what we do every Shabbos morning with breakthrough rooms. We tell our stories as reflected in the Parsha Shavua, right? So this particular reading is of special significance for me because it's all about storytelling. Its power lies in looking ahead by looking backwards and being present in the moment. And so all of these things are working together at the same time. The word remember is an interesting word because it's to remember, right? To put the pieces back together. Um, and um, and so, as a storyteller, this is both a powerful and a reminder of what we're doing all the time when we're reading Torah, which is embracing, integrating, and seeing ourselves right now as our friend and teacher Rabbi Sean Zevitt. This is not would say this is not a history lesson. This is happening in real time, right? This is happening in real time. Shosh and Moshe.
I just wanted to add, because that was the comment I was thinking of making, is that I think hearing this pasuk, I guess, this section phrase in this context, in this room tonight, mean as opposed to or different than hearing it as a Haggadah. I felt it more, especially with the 3 prompts. I just felt it more that the story and my family, my Jewish family history, my people, just sort of hit me tonight. So toda rabah. And if you could possibly put those prompts in the chat, I would love them, and maybe might use them a bit on Pesach.
Sure.
An alternative to that, Reb Leila, is for you to send me the prompts, and I already took a screenshot of everyone, and I can send it to everyone, the prompts.
I think
Okay.
Moshe had something here.
We'll
Okay.
do that.
Unlike, I found a difference from this and the breakthrough rooms, that with the breakthrough rooms, as we tell our story, we're conscious of the time and it just sort of comes out. But as I was thinking and getting deeper, I found that I was editing, and I continue refining as we've done in the storytelling workshops. But I was doing it and nobody was hearing it but me. But that gave me the freedom to make it as good as I could get in that time. So that was an interesting difference in experience.
Thanks, Moshe. Reb Leila, do you have any chatima for us? And then I'm going to put in the chat and tell people about the class you're leading,
Sure.
and then we're going to come in for a landing.
My chatima is that this is something that each one of us can do very, very much for ourselves, either individually, that you can choose for yourself a section of text and do it individually. You can do it for yourself, even if you're not in a group. Even if you're not in a group, you can read it slowly to yourself and then sit in silence with it, and then let the questions emerge. let the questions emerge, even if they don't have anything precisely or directly to do with the text. Because who would have thought necessarily that from this you would be thinking about your story individually? Some of you might have, but not necessarily. So allow yourself to come up with your own very personal questions that emerge from a text and read it repeatedly, and let the text become a metaphor for whatever is going on with you, because text is metaphor very often. And I was going to mention the class, but you can do it for me.
I have it together here if you like. By the way, I think it was Reb Heschel, of blessed memory, who said that all of Torah is metaphor.
Yes, yes.
So in the chat, and again, I'll have this information and I can send it out to everybody. Reb Leila will be leading a 6-week class in this process, Kriyat HaKodesh, and it will be shared with the Washington Quakers. And Sabrina, hi, welcome. Sabrina McCarthy is organizing it, and her email address is right there. And the offering is listening to the Heart of Genesis on the first 3, 6, 7 parshiot of the Torah portions of Bereshit, of the book of Genesis. It starts on October 13th for 6 Fridays from 10 to 11:15. And Reb Leila is asking for anyone who wants to take the class to commit to the full series, where there's a fee of $150. And any need further information, feel free to call Reb Leila.
Yeah, I'll be happy to tell you about it. Sabrina will be happy to tell you about it, since she herself took the first six sessions. And I'd love to have any of you in the class, because it is intended to be an interfaith class of Quakers and Jews.
So,
or believers or non-believers or whoever.
Is the class on Zoom or face to face?
Class is on Zoom.
got your question in there, Rick. That was good. All right, everybody, my fine friends, if you are here for the first time or have been here once or twice with us, and if you'd like to be on our mailing list to join us for other learning opportunities, but especially on a Shabbat morning, this is very similar to what we do. We're both a joyous and contemplative gathering. And we have a number, mostly Jewish, but we have a number of non-Jews who have found a spiritual home with us as well. So I invite you to put your email address, if you'd like to be on the mailing list, into the chat now, and we'd love to see you again. And not just when Reb Leila is here, which coming attraction sometime after the Chagim, maybe in November sometime, Reb Leila will return and to talk about the important work that she does with the Ugandan Jewish community. And that will that'll be very, very special to hear that. So we're going to
be back for 2 weeks in Uganda, and it was one of the most powerful experiences.
All right, we're going to go out with a nigun. As always, feel free to sing along. Yada-rai-rai, yada-rai-rai, yidi-rai-rai-rai-rai, yababai, yidi-rai-rai-rai-rai, yababai, yidi-rai-rai-rai-rai, yai-rai-rai-rai, yada-rai-rai. Yiddy-rai-rai, yiddy-rai-rai, yiddy-rai-rai-rai-rai, yada-rai, yiddy-rai-rai-rai-rai, yai-rai-rai-rai, yada-rai-rai, yai-rai-rai-rai, yada-rai-rai, yai-rai, yai-rai-rai-rai, yada-rai-rai. Yai rai, yai yai rai rai, yai lai di rai rai. Ai 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 yada rai rai. Thank you all for coming and gracing this holy Zumagog. We hope you have a good night and Laila Tov to all, and I hope to see you again. Old and new friends. Hoppa! Hi. Laila Tov, everyone. Thank you, Reb Leila.